Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the novel, Chapter 13. Home is where the heart is. Yvette Kale was glad to see that her husband was returning. He had survived another trip into the past. She also realized why her father had insisted that she stay with the Kales for many of his expeditions after that. If it hadn't been for that encounter, he would never have run across her husband. She also started to wonder when her father met with Dr. Roivas. As she thought that, she saw something happening in front of her eyes. She was now seeing the library, and she saw her father standing there with Dr. Roivas. As she watched, she saw her father hand a large glass container to Dr. Roivas. She then watched as Dr. Roivas put it on a shelf and saw what looked like a book slide in front of it. It then dawned on her what she had just seen. She had seen her father giving the heart of Mantarak to Dr. Roivas. When she blinked her eyes, Yvette was stunned to see her husband looking at her. She could see a concerned look in his eyes, but she could also tell he had something good to tell them both. She also heard Alexandra Roivas ask, "Yvette, are you all right? You spaced out just as Richard got back. Did you see Pius and his ancient again?" She shook her head and said, "No, I saw my father here. He gave the heart of Mantarak to your grandfather, Alexandra. They even hid it in the library." As she said that, she saw a look of disbelief cross Alexandra's face. She glanced at her husband and saw that he was thinking about it. She then heard her husband say, "This is good news. If they hid it in the library, it's probably on one of the bookshelves. Did you happen to see which shelf it was on?" Yvette thought about it and started to wonder which shelf they would hide it on. She closed her eyes to think about it. As she did so, she said, "By the way, hon, what did you find out with my father that you are happy about? I could see you were happy by the look in your eyes." She listened as her husband said, "Yes, in that last chapter, Pius said that this was our 10th encounter. That means that we have 4 more encounters. I have a feeling that once we make it past the 10th chapter, we will defeat Pius." Yvette heard all of that, but she started remembering something her father had told her once. She opened her eyes, faced Alexandra, and said, "Alexandra, did your grandfather have any books by my father?" She watched as Alexandra nodded and said, "Yes, there is one out there by your father, but my grandfather never let anyone touch it." Yvette smiled, and then ran out of the room. She moved quickly to the library and started to scan the shelves. She found what she was looking for as she heard Alexandra and Richard running after her. She pushed the book as she heard Alexandra ask, "Yvette, what did you just realize?" Yvette smiled as the book moved aside to reveal the jar with the heart in it. She then said, "My father never wrote any books, simply because a written word can't totally explain how a person feels when they first see an ancient site. That means that the book was a hidden panel to hide Mantarak's heart." She lifted the jar out and saw the surprised look on Alexandra's face. She saw her husband smile as well, knowing he realized that both her father and Dr. Roivas were very clever people. As she started to hand the heart to Alexandra, she noticed that Alexandra jumped and turned to face a door she hadn't noticed before. She started to wonder if something was trying to come through that unopened door. Alexandra Roivas jumped when she heard the sound of someone knocking on a door. As she looked towards the end of the library and noticed a door that looked like it headed to the front of the house, she started to wonder if it was another way out to the front of the house. She watched it suspiciously and then heard Richard say, "What's wrong, Alexandra? Did you hear something?" She nodded and said, "I heard someone knocking at that door. I've never noticed that door before. I do remember him mentioning an observatory of sorts." She looked at the door again and started to wonder if she really had heard someone knocking on it. She moved forward to it and said, "All right, Yvette, is there really someone knocking on this door?" She watched as Yvette shook her head. That gave her some comfort, and then heard Yvette say, "It's a trick of the mind. Maybe you should use the recovery spell on yourself." She nodded in agreement, but knew they should check out this room. As she opened the door, the first thing she noticed was a large telescope. She then stepped into the room and watched as Yvette and Richard entered. As they looked around, she watched the other two look at panels on the wall, each of which looked like part of a turning mechanism. She then walked over to a globe on the floor and noticed a small glass lens in it. She peered through the lens and noticed a strange panel in the room below her. She then said, "I think the observatory is over a room in the basement. From what I can see, there's a strange panel underneath this globe." She noticed that Richard had walked over to look at the thing and said, "We may have to check it out later. Isn't the basement door still locked?" She nodded and then watched as Richard started to pace. As he paced the room, Alexandra heard Yvette say to him, "What about the spells you found with my father? Maybe one of them would do something to that window you two both see. I remember seeing a piece of paper floating in it." Alexandra thought about it for a moment, and then remembered that when they had last looked at the window, it had been surrounded by a strange red haze. She smiled when she realized they now had a spell to remove that barrier. She quickly left the observatory and headed for the upstairs floor. When she reached the foyer, she heard Richard shout, "Alexandra, wait. While we are in here, let's find out how the Mantarak rune affects all the spells." She stopped for a moment and looked at him. He had a very good point. She paused for a moment and looked over the spells they had. Her first thought was to try it with the recovery spell. She took a chance and cast the spell. The second she did, she felt better mentally and physically. She glanced over at Richard and Yvette, who looked at her as if she had changed for the better. She smiled and said, "Looks like Mantarak's rune recovers both sanity and health." She then glanced at Yvette and offered the book, saying, "Do you want to try one?" She watched as Yvette took the book and said, "Yes, let me see what happens if I combine the area rune with summon rune." She watched as Yvette cast the spell with those two runes and the Mantarak rune, and was surprised to see the rune floating over Yvette's head. She then saw Yvette smile as she said, "I feel refreshed. I guess this spell will constantly make one feel well." She then watched as Yvette handed the book over to Richard then, and said, "Do you want to try a different spell, hon?" She watched as he took the book and looked over the spells before he said, "Well, I don't think the other spells will act differently, but I want to check the Reveal Invisible spell. Maybe using the Mantarok rune with it will allow us all to see things that are approaching the house. When I stepped out to the car, I saw something out there. She watched as Richard then cast the spell and heard Yvette scream in fright. She knew why Yvette was screaming. When Richard had cast the spell, it looked like he disappeared, just like when he started a chapter. Richard looked up when he heard Yvette scream. He also noticed a shocked look on Alexandra's face. He looked around for a moment and wondered what had scared them. And then he heard his wife say, "What happened to my husband? You didn't start another chapter. We hadn't even found the next one. What happened to him?" He took that moment to glance at his hands and was stunned to see they looked like shadows to him. It was then he realized what had happened. While the other runes made stuff appear, the Mantarok rune made the spell create a perfect camouflage. He appeared invisible to everyone. He silently walked to Yvette's side. When he was right by her, part of him wanted to break the tension they were all under and do something a little devilish to his wife. He decided not to, and then said, "I'm right here, Yvette. The spell just made me invisible." He then heard Alexandra say, "So that's what the Mantarok rune does with that spell. Any clue how long it will last?" Richard went to shake his head, but realized no one would see him. He then looked at the tome and decided to cast the Dispel spell with the Mantarok rune. As he went to cast the spell, he said, "I'm not sure, but maybe the Dispel spell will end its duration." Once the spell was cast, he saw a look of relief on Yvette's face as she hugged him. He then heard Alexandra say, as she took the tome, "I'll give you two a moment. I'm going to head up to that window and dispel the magic." He then watched as Alexandra ran up to the upstairs hall. Once he heard the door close, he looked into Yvette's eyes and said, "You know, hon, I was very tempted to massage you in that way you like while I was invisible. The only thing that kept me from doing that was this whole situation." He noticed she was blushing when she responded, "It's all right. I probably would have freaked out. Now, why don't we get up there before Alexandra starts to wonder? Besides, right now we shouldn't be leaving each other alone." He nodded in agreement, and they went up to the second floor. When they entered the doorway to the second floor hallway, Richard heard the sound of a barrier being dispelled. They rushed to where the window was and saw it was no longer there. He also saw Alexandra reaching for a page floating in the air. He watched as she grabbed it and heard her say, "You were right, Yvette. It was hiding a page." He then saw her look out the window and heard her gasp. He watched as Yvette stepped forward and heard her say, "I told you the things were gathering. I also see more creatures arriving. Let's just hope they don't reach this window before we find a way to stop this." Richard then said, "As we head back to the secret room, maybe we should try locking the door as well. Hopefully that will be enough. Now let's get back to the secret room and begin that new chapter." He watched as Alexandra led the way and followed her and his wife. As they walked, he heard Yvette say, "When does this chapter take place?" It was a good question, since he was sure that no more chapters would take place at Mantarok's temple. They had entered the foyer when Alexandra said, "It looks like it's back in Amiens, France, in the year 1485 AD. I hope you are ready for another encounter in the cathedral, Richard." He watched as she then locked the front door. When the door was locked, he just said, "Terrific. I just hope that Anthony might have died. That spell just kept rotting him. He might look just like Pius now. I just hope he is dead." They had just entered the library when he heard Yvette say, "With any luck, he is. However, we should find out what has been happening in the cathedral." He then watched as she froze and realized she was having another vision of sorts. They all stopped until she broke out of it gasping. This worried him, especially when he could see a panicked look in her eyes. He put his hands on her shoulders and said, "Yvette, what's wrong? What did you see?" He felt his blood go cold when he heard her say, "It's a large creature. Pius summoned it to protect something, and I think it's in the cathedral. You must be careful. It's very powerful." Richard took his wife's arm and said, "I will be, trust me." They then continued to the secret room. As they walked, he said to Alexandra, "Alexandra, when I go back, I want you to be careful as well. If the creatures are getting nearer to us, we need to stay safe. We'll also keep the heart of Mantarok in the secret room." He saw her nod when she opened the door to the secret room. "I was thinking the same thing. This room may be the safest in the entire house. However, due to Yvette's reaction to events while you were in the last chapter, I think we should hide it, like in a drawer." He nodded in agreement. He then stepped to the middle of the room and said, "All right, Alexandra, let's start the next chapter." He noticed Alexandra hesitate a bit, and he wondered what was wrong. As he stood there, he heard Yvette say, "Hon, why don't you take the gun we found with you? It could help." He shook his head and said, "A gun in the era crossbows ruled? It would be very suspicious, especially if bullets were left behind. The sword should be enough." Richard then noticed that Alexandra had been thinking about it, and finally nodded, saying, "He's right. Until we get to more current chapters, he's going to have to go with just his sword. Just take care of yourself." He nodded, knowing full well that he would survive the chapter. He then watched as Alexandra put the page in the book and said, "All right, let's begin heresy. I just hope this isn't the time of the Inquisition." He nodded in agreement and watched as the world dissolved around him.